Welcome to Versus History with Elliot Watson and Patrick O'Shaughnessy.
Good afternoon, I am Dr. Elliot L. Watson and with me is Patrick O'Shaughnessy. How are you, Patrick?
I'm very well, Elliot. It's great to be on half term, first and foremost.
Yes.
Secondly, it's great to be debating with you again. And
Yes.
Thirdly, it's nice to be in some unfamiliar surrounds.
Now, where are we? We are in a little gem that Patrick has turned me onto. It is an Arabic cafe in the centre of Bahrain. Beautiful place. So what you can hear around us will be the ambient noises of a cafe. So clinking of glasses and music in the background. But I think it adds a little bit to this podcast today, Patrick. What do you think?
Indeed, contrary to popular opinion, teachers do not live in their classrooms.
No, they do not, and nor should they.
Yeah, exactly. So we're out and about having some lovely mint tea and the occasional biscuit. I suppose which leads us on in some way, some form to our debate today. Do you want to mention what it is and then I can big up the Twitter followers?
Okay, so the debate today is going to be, it is the kind of debate that we see at GCSE and post-16. It's that traditional debate of essentially structuralism versus intentionalism. It is, does Hitler come to power between 1929 and 1933 because of his own efforts, or does he come to power because of the environment that allowed him to come to power, the environment which consisted of the Great Depression? So that's basically what we're going to argue today. I'll be arguing that the Great Depression really helped to stimulate Hitler's rise to power, and Patrick is going to be arguing the opposite.
Yeah, that it was other stuff, such as the SA, propaganda, Hitler's electioneering and an appeal, so on and so forth. But before we get there, we do have some more Twitter followers, Elliot.
Oh, do we? Go on then.
Yeah, and we shout out a few of them. I can't do them all because there's too many, but in no particular order, here we go. M. Beckett History, thank you very much indeed. Sarah Squire, Stephen White, Lisa Jagger, the History Department of Prestatyn High School, Rihanna Whitrees, Barbara Hibbert, Robert Hughes, Curriculum Sheets, Chris Young, Jamie Dockery. Thank you all very, very much indeed for subscribing to us on iTunes and for following us on Twitter. We really do appreciate it.
Yes, getting close to 600, I think now, Twitter followers, is that right?
Nearly, but not quite, but we are on the cusp of it, which is great news.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Versus History.
The internet, as I always say.
The internet. Right,
It's a good thing.
So where now?
Okay, let's just have a little chat about what we're going to do today. Elliot's mentioned that we're going to be debating the reasons, the causal factors behind Hitler coming to power. Before we do that, I've got a little quote from a gentleman called James Carroll who teaches history in the UK. One of the reasons that me and Elliot took up the gauntlet of doing this podcast series is because we wanted to model the scaffolding and architecture of historical debate. And today is a causal debate.
Yes, it is.
So, a little quote here from James Carroll. We don't often do this, but I think it is pertinent because we're going to try and talk as professional academic historians talk. A little quote from one of his teaching history articles. Historians rarely use overt causal conjunctions such as because. Instead, they tend to bury the analytical ductwork of causal analysis by using verbs and nouns instead of conjunctions. In doing so, historians can then characterise and prioritise causal factors, as exemplified by Kershaw, who used arise, allow or develop, as opposed to therefore, so, or because. So essentially we're going to try and talk how historians talk in our causal analysis, and we're going to use some of Professor Ian Kershaw's historiography today.
I think absolutely right. It is important that our students have a wider lexicon of language so that they can communicate history in a more nuanced, more subtle fashion, rather than simply relying on this caused that.
Quite often at GCSE, A-level, IB, diploma level, there's this almost false dichotomy presented that
What do you mean false dichotomy, first of all?
It's either one thing or another, that the reasons behind Hitler's rise to power are somehow mutually exclusive.
That they're either A or they're B and nothing besides.
Yeah, in some ways, I suppose Versus History is a bit like that. So
it is.
Because I'm going to be arguing one thing and you're going to be arguing the other. But the truth is probably somewhere between us. But I think it's important to mention that in terms of GCSE, it's often presented that the Great Depression, without it, Hitler would have been nothing. or essentially that without the Great Depression, extremists wouldn't have risen to power. I think the Great Depression explains why democracy went by the wayside by January 1933, but it doesn't explain explicitly why it was the Nazis as opposed to maybe a different extremist
That's true.
group,
That is absolutely
why
true.
they came to power. So we're going to try and move beyond the sort of mutually exclusive, it's A or it's B for you.
Yes. So you may hear a few clinking of glasses or placing down of glasses on tables. That is just Patrick and myself enjoying a little bit of tea. so please don't let that put you off. So, shall we begin?
Shall I start with the 1920s then, Elliot?
Why don't you?
Okay, in the 1920s, Hitler assumes leadership of the Nazi Party from Anton Drexler and gives them their name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. There's an attempted putsch which fails in 1923. Hitler goes to jail, and key thing here is he drops his strategy, but not his goal of getting rid of democracy, but he drops his strategy of trying to seize power via violent putsch. Now, in the 1920s, Hitler essentially remodels the Nazi Party without changing their goals. He is going to put Gauleiters in control of local regions. He is going to make sure there are efficient functionaries running the party's finances. He's going to try and seek support of big business owners. Essentially, he is going to do lots of grisly, boring stuff underneath the bonnet, which means that when the opportunity arises, the Nazi Party are judiciously placed to challenge for power. But I think it's fair to say, and Richard Evans, I'm sure, and Professor Ian Kershaw would agree, that in 1928, on the cusp of the Depression, the Nazis were still a fringe party. In the 1928 elections, they win just 12 seats in the Reichstag, polling 2.6% of the vote, or 800,000 Germans vote for them. So essentially, the Nazis were still very much in the wilderness on the cusp of the Great Depression.
And so by 1928, the Nazis are very much a fringe party. You mentioned that in 1928 they polled 2.6% of the parliamentary electoral votes. Well, actually in 1924 they polled 3%. So what's happened over that period of time is they actually have declined in terms of the number of seats that they have in the Reichstag. So in October 1929 we have the Wall Street crash in the United States. And although this doesn't cause the depression, it triggers the depression, or it reveals a depression. And the consequences of this depression are felt worldwide. We have to remember that America were providing loans and financial assistance to the Germans as a result of the Dawes Plan in 24 and the Young Plan. And as a result of this, Germany was very much dependent upon these loans. The first thing that happens after the October Wall Street crash is the loans are recalled. The market for German goods dries up because all of the countries of the world can no longer afford really the expensive goods from other countries. German industry essentially grinds to a halt. Production levels fall. Unemployment rises to a point where in 1933, when Hitler does come to power, there are 6 million Germans out of work. This results in poverty. Extremist parties begin to offer solutions to those problems, and I think that's where Hitler comes in. But I think this is where we pass back to Patrick.
Of course, the Great Depression creates the context where an extremist can rise to power, because that's ultimately what happens. Hitler becomes Chancellor in January 1933. But I think it's apt and judicious for us to note that the Depression in and of itself cannot explain Hitler's rise in particular, because all the Depression does is creates a context for someone to exploit. That someone happened to be Hitler. Also doesn't tell us that which the Nazi Party and Hitler did and that which they offered to capitalise on this unique set of circumstances. I'm essentially going to argue that yes, the Depression plays a key facilitating role, but it's then up to Hitler and the Nazi Party to seize that opportunity, which they do. Okay, just some political context then. I think it's fair to say that German democracy was dead before 1933. We often attribute Hitler and the Nazi Party as being the slayers of democracy, which is to some extent true, but in 1930, 5 decrees were used. In 1931, there were 44 decrees used, and in 1933, 66 decrees were used, and the Reichstag only met for a mere 5 days.
Can you just explain, Patrick, for our listeners, what you mean by decrees?
Yes, of course. I mean, inherent in the Weimar Constitution were safeguards to supposedly protect it. Article 48. Chancellor could, with permission of the President, circumvent the Reichstag and essentially dictate laws to be passed without the need for them to be passed by the Reichstag or the Parliament. So essentially, the process of circumventing, going round, ignoring democracy was already in place before Hitler becomes Chancellor himself.
Okay.
Just to reiterate, 1932, the Reichstag only meets for 5 days. There's nothing to discuss, essentially, because the Chancellor, with the permission of the President, Hindenburg, is using the decree anyway.
Okay, so my argument is basically going to be that without the Great Depression and the ensuing problems, an extremist party like the National Socialists would never have been able to gain the traction that it did. Because I think we all know, and it's something that we do, whether it's right or wrong, we teach the GCSE and post-16 students, that with extreme problems come extreme solutions. If we look around the world today, those countries that are enjoying stable and prosperous a democratic environment, we don't see extremist parties for the most part. And I think that's very much the case from 1929 to 32.
Normal people don't vote for nutters if there's no need to.
Well, actually, Leon Trotsky said something slightly more elegant than that. He said that revolution is a fork and a knife question. It is a cheese and a bread question, which basically means that only at the points where people are deprived of the very means of existence, food and shelter, will they turn to revolution or to extremism. And my contention is going to be that the extremists we saw from 1929 to 32 to 33 were a direct result, or the success they enjoyed was a direct result of the Depression and the problems. In 1924, the Nazi Party, as I mentioned earlier, has won only 3% of the parliamentary electoral votes. In 1932, they have 33%. Now, of course, we don't want to say mistake correlation for causation here, post hoc ergo propter hoc, but I do believe that it is impossible to separate the Great Depression from the rise of the Nazis. And I think if we look at people such as Richard Evans, I'm going to quote Richard Evans here. He says, "None of this could disguise the fact, however, that in the autumn of 1929, the Nazi Party was still very much on the fringes of politics. It would need a catastrophe of major dimensions if an extremist party like the Nazis was to gain mass support. In 1929, with the sudden collapse of the economy in the wake of the stock exchange crash in New York, it came." Now, I'm just going to leave that there for the moment because I think it's a good juncture to jump in.
Yes, of course. I have a quote here from Dr. Neil Gregor. Essentially, Hitler was able to capitalise on the efforts of earlier years. So during the Depression, he was able to essentially exploit some of this rebranding, remodelling of the early Nazi Party. There were now Gauleiters in place. So the Nazi Party, this is different from 1923, they'd become a national party. They were able to essentially reach out beyond the rural areas of Germany, Bavaria, so on and so forth. They had a national framework in place. Had this not been in place, Depression or no Depression, they definitely wouldn't have come to power.
Right, so basically you're saying that the framework was put in place prior to the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and it was because it was already there, they were able to exploit and take advantage of the Great Depression.
It laid the platform. I think it's fair to say that if the Depression happened without the remodelling, rebranding and reworking of the Nazi Party in the 1920s, putting in place the SS, etc., the Nazi Party wouldn't have come to power, I think. I think that's fair to say. I think another thing that it's important that we clear up, quite often the misconception of students, is that all Hitler did was lambasted democracy and its ills. That would be somewhat reductive. Yes, Hitler did. He was at great pains to point out that democracy was un-German and was the root cause of all Germans' failings since the end of World War I. But I've got a quote here from Professor Ian Kershaw. Hitler's speeches were not simply negative, not just an attack on the existing system. He presented a vision, a utopia, an ideal national liberation through strength and unity. He offered a programme. Hitler's was not a conventional political programme, it was a political crusade. He talks at length, if you listen to any of Hitler's speeches, he talks at length about this idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, a classless Germany united on the basis of strength, race and culture. This was particularly appealing to young people. This also became increasingly appealing to rank and file Germans, your average German, as the mainstream political parties proved themselves to be inept at dealing with the problems created by the context of the Depression. So I think if we were to say Hitler A, did nothing, that would be wrong. B, that all Hitler did was lambasted democracy, that would also be wrong, because he offered a stark alternative, a quite repellent alternative, but one that in the context of the times could gain political traction, and gain traction it did. I think it's an apt time for you to come in now, Elliot.
I think so. You mentioned the ineptitude of the government to deal with the problems of the Great Depression, and I think that's a good segue into my argument. Here's what we have to remember. You mentioned it earlier, that Article 48, the element of the Weimar Constitution that enabled Hindenburg, the president, to rule by decree in order to circumvent the Reichstag, so he didn't need need to get laws passed. This was used very frequently in 1930, 1931, 32. I think what we also have to remember is that people were looking at the Weimar government for solutions to their problems, and none were forthcoming. In March 1930, the new Chancellor, Henrik Brüning from the Catholic Centre Party, he has to go to Hindenburg to use Article 48 to enact his policies. He later has to go and ask Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag in July 1930 to call elections, because we have so little concord and accord between the political parties. Instead of forging an alliance within the Reichstag to solve the problems of the Great Depression, we end up with political parties squabbling over minor differences. And I think it's this point that I need to drive forward. Without the Depression, without people suffering these extreme problems, you wouldn't have had them looking for solutions looking to Parliament for solutions, and then being disillusioned when they couldn't solve them. It was into this environment that you get the extremist parties. Now, you mentioned earlier that Hitler increased his appeal, but I would say this is true, but as did most of the extremist parties, the Communist Party as well. In the September election that was called after Brüning asked Hindenburg to dissolve the parliament, how many seats do the Nazis get? They get 230. They're now the largest party in the Reichstag. You look at 1924, 3%, and then you get 230 seats in 1932. This is no coincidence. This isn't simply the appeal of the Nazi Party. This is a direct consequence of an environment that was conducive to extremism. It wasn't plain sailing for the Nazis, because in November 1932 they actually lose seats, and in November 1932 they gain 196 seats. So I think this is where the complexities come in. It wasn't a clear trajectory as soon as the Great Depression hit to power. There were other things at play, but to my mind, the environment that creates so many of these problems really is that which is created by the Great Depression.
Yeah, I'm going to build on using the words of Professor Kershaw from your argument. There was nothing inevitable about Hitler's accession to power. It's important we remember that.
Yes.
And Kershaw goes on to argue political miscalculation by those with regular access to the corridors of power, rather than any actions on the part of the Nazi leader, played a larger role in placing him in the Chancellor's seat. First and foremost, Hitler could have been executed for his leading role in the Munich Putsch, but he wasn't. So it was the actions of others, according to Kershaw, rather than Hitler himself. We then need to explain why it was Hitler in particular, because you were right to mention significant stratas of the working class in particular were not gone on anything to do with the Nazis. They were more likely to look towards the communists.
This is true.
So I think the first thing I would like to mention, above and beyond the Volksgemeinschaft, the classless society of Germans united, and the fact that Hitler didn't talk about the Nazis being a political party. Far from it. They were a national racial movement which could encompass all strands of social action. I think this resonated a lot with many Germans, working class and otherwise.
Yes.
But I think now it's important to talk about the Nazis in particular, the SA and the SS. This was very, very clever from Hitler, because the SA actually contributed to the chaos in the streets by causing lots of it. Brawls, smashing up of the meetings of political parties. But almost in a paradoxical way, Hitler could then present the SA and his SS as the saviours to the very problem that they were contributing to.
Ah, right, okay, I see.
Furthermore, many Germans were won over by this seeming beacon of light, strength and uniformity, concord and discipline in the context of strife, economic turbulence. So Hitler could present himself and his SA and his SS as the solution to the very problems that existed. Little quote here from Scott Reeves. Although the SA was not solely responsible for Hitler becoming Chancellor, that was a complicated mix of the Depression, Nazi appeal and the weakness of his political opponents, it certainly contributed to his success. Now we know in 1934 he's going to do away with some of the leaders Ernst Röhm.
Yes.
But I think we'd be wrong to overlook the role of the SA, although it's also apt to mention that the Nazi Party were not the only political party with a sort of stormtrooper political auxiliary army paramilitary wing.
I don't really want to just keep hammering the same argument, because really my argument is that context created the monster.
And my argument is the context was seized upon by the monster.
Right, so we're coming at essentially this. We're coming at the same conclusion, but from very different angles.
I think it's that then. I'll just throw in my last bit of argument here about propaganda. If you've ever done a 16-mark question or an essay on why did Hitler come to power, you will often get students making the mistake of censorship. Well, that doesn't really happen. The Nazis can't censor anything until they're in power.
True.
But propaganda does play a key role here. I think it's apt to mention that the role of Dr. Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi Party more generally in propaganda, in using propaganda and harnessing it for Nazis' eventual electoral success is key. This is something I learnt, that Hitler wasn't actually a German citizen until he stood for the presidency on the 5th of May 1932. He actually had to become a German citizen by swearing loyalty to the Weimar regime.
Curious.
But this is coming back to propaganda. Hitler's going to use the slogan, the Führer over Germany. He's going to hire a plane in a quite sort of American style, and he's going to go city hopping. This was, according to Professor Kerschel, a remarkable electioneering performance, the like of which had never been seen in Germany. Leading on to this, whilst Hitler actually loses the election race to Hindenburg, the Führerkult, manufactured commodity of Nazi propaganda, and once the property of a tiny collection of fanatics, was now on the way to being sold to a third of the German population. So essentially propaganda is harnessed by the Nazi Party to a really successful extent, I would argue. So that must be something else we consider, in addition to the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, and the essay and the miscalculations of others, in explaining or helping to explain or becoming a causal factor in Hitler's rise to power. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree, but I think the overarching umbrella environment is what's important here, because prior to the Great Depression, we had Joseph Goebbels in charge of propaganda. Prior to the Depression, we had the Gauleiters. So essentially, it was the Nazi Party was a national party. We had the structure and the systems in place. The propaganda was going gangbusters, and the money was coming in from the business and industrial leaders. And yet, we still had 1928. We only at 2.6% of the Reichstag in favour of the Nazis. So
all true.
But so we still need a trigger. We still need a trigger. The platform and the systems might be there, but if there is no trigger, the systems and the platform might be there ad infinitum until everybody dies. Now, I'm just going to say one last thing, and this is from J.M. Roberts. It was only the onset of the 1929 economic crisis that gave Nazism its opportunity. Now, your argument is that they were prepared to seize the opportunity. My discussion might focus on, had there never been an opportunity, would we have ever heard really of Adolf Hitler?
I completely agree. I think without the Great Depression, Hitler is going absolutely nowhere. But without Hitler's work, the Depression would have been seized upon by probably someone else. Maybe of the same political variety, maybe different. We'll never know.
We will never know.
But come to power, Hitler did in January 1933. I think the final caveat I'd like to add is another misconception by GCSE students. This does not mean that Hitler is yet Führer, the single leader of Germany.
No. Becoming the Chancellor in January 1933 is a very small step. Only a handful of Nazis in the cabinet. Hindenburg still holds power. He doesn't have a majority in the Reichstag, etc., etc. It's going to take another, at least a year's worth of conniving and manipulation in order for him to become the Führer by the end of 1934.
Yeah, and further mistakes by the existing political community. Okay, shall we call that a conclusion then?
Why not? That sounds like a good spot to leave it. Now, at the end of the podcast now, what we're going to do is we're going to decide, or we're going to discuss what we really think.
Yeah, just do that really quickly.
Go on then, Pat, what do you really think?
I think probably that's the closest I've ever been to what I really think in an actual versus history debate.
Yeah.
Because I do believe that without the Great Depression, we wouldn't be talking about Hitler now, and we wouldn't be teaching about him. So I don't think he would have come to power. It took those unique, bespoke political circumstances for someone like Hitler with a program like his to actually rise to power. So in essence, I was actually arguing something very, very close to what I actually believe. What about you?
I think it's exactly the same. I think it's almost impossible to separate the structuralist and the intentionalist argument, the arguments that Hitler contributed to his success and the Nazis' success, as well as other issues, but that these cannot be separated really from the effects of the Great Depression. Because, as I keep telling my students, without extreme problems, people are not going to look for extreme solutions.
Hopefully what we've showed there is something close to Carr's and Evans' argument about a hierarchy of causes rather than one cause versus another.
I think so. I hope so, yes. Okay, so
the internet, let's download it, let's subscribe, let's get on versushistory.com, let's get on iTunes and download. We need your support, and thank you for your support.
And so from us in this cafe in downtown Bahrain, it is goodbye.
It is goodbye, and thank you for your ears.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Thank you for downloading and listening to this edition of Versus History. Subscribe. Visit us at our website www.versushistory.com.